200 years ago, if you lived almost anywhere in Europe, you lived within earshot of wolves. By the early 1900s, in most of the continent, they were simply gone. Not because the land changed, not because the climate shifted, because of a story you were told as a child, and what that story convinced an entire continent to do. Start with the scale of it. Wolves once ranged across nearly all of Europe, from the Scottish Highlands to the forests of Germany, from the Pyrenees to the plains of Poland. By the time the 20th century began, they had been eliminated from Britain, France, Germany, and most of Western and Central Europe entirely. Not driven to smaller numbers. Erased. In England, the last wolves were likely killed off sometime in the 1500s. In Scotland, a widely repeated account credits a hunter named Sir Ewan Cameron with killing the last wolf around 1680 in a glen in the Highlands. True extinction dates are messy and disputed, but the direction is not. Country after country, the wolf simply stopped existing within its borders. Why would an entire continent go to that much trouble over one predator? The obvious answer is livestock. Wolves killed sheep, and sheep meant a farmer's livelihood, so farmers killed wolves back. That's real, and it mattered. But it isn't close to the whole story, because the scale of the extermination campaigns, and the money and manpower governments poured into them, goes far beyond what a rational cost-benefit calculation over lost livestock would justify. Here's where the story gets stranger. Kings didn't just tolerate wolf hunting, they institutionalized it. In medieval France, under Charlemagne, the crown established an official government office dedicated entirely to hunting wolves, called the louveterie. This wasn't a temporary militia responding to a specific problem. It was a standing institution, staffed by professional wolf hunters, called lieutenants de louveterie, that persisted, on and off, for over 1,000 years. France treated wolf elimination not as pest control, but as a matter of state. To understand why, you need one specific event that terrified an entire kingdom. Between 1764 and 1767, in the rural Gévaudan region of south-central France, something began killing people. Not livestock. People. Historical records, from the period document somewhere between 60 and 100 deaths, attributed to what came to be called the Beast of Gévaudan, described by terrified witnesses as a wolf-like creature, unusually large, unusually bold, seemingly unafraid of humans. Panic spread far beyond the region itself. King Louis XV, ruling from Versailles, personally dispatched royal hunters to track and kill the creature, offering rewards that would be worth a small fortune today. Newspapers across France, and eventually across Europe, followed the story obsessively. Whether the beast was one exceptionally large wolf, several wolves, or something else entirely, remains genuinely debated by historians. What isn't debated is the effect it had. An entire kingdom's fear of wolves, already simmering for centuries, boiled over into something close to national hysteria. And the killing that followed wasn't limited to Gévaudan. It echoed across the country for decades. That fear didn't stay confined to hunting policy. It got written down, and it got told to children. The story you likely know as Little Red Riding Hood exists in versions stretching back centuries across European oral tradition, eventually collected and published by the Brothers Grimm in the early 1800s under the title Rotkäppchen. In it, a wolf disguises itself, deceives a child, and devours her grandmother. It's not a subtle metaphor. Across dozens of European folk traditions, wolves appear again and again as the disguised predator, the thing that looks almost trustworthy right up until it kills you. These stories weren't harmless entertainment sitting apart from real policy. They were the emotional infrastructure that made large-scale, state-funded extermination feel not just acceptable, but necessary. You don't need a spreadsheet proving wolves are an existential threat if you've been raised from childhood believing they are. By the time you reach the early 1900s, the numbers tell the result plainly. Wolves were extinct across Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and most of what's now called Western Europe. Populations held on only in scattered, remote pockets, small numbers in the mountains of Italy, isolated groups in Spain and Portugal, larger, but still pressured populations across parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, where terrain and lower human density offered more places to hide. In Italy specifically, by the 1970s, the entire wolf population had collapsed to somewhere around 100 individuals, confined almost entirely to remote stretches of the central and southern Apennine Mountains. Researcher Luigi Boitani, a wildlife biologist who has studied Italian wolves for decades, documented just how close the population came to disappearing entirely from the peninsula. A century of hunting, poisoning, and habitat loss had pushed one of Europe's original apex predators to the edge of a very narrow cliff. And then, without anyone planning it, something reversed. Starting in the late 20th century, legal protections began changing the equation. The Berne Convention in 1979, followed by the European Union's Habitats Directive in 1992, made wolves a protected species across much of the continent, banning the hunting and poisoning that had defined the previous several hundred years. Nobody reintroduced wolves to most of these countries. Nobody trucked animals in and released them with fanfare. What happened instead was quieter and, in a strange way, more remarkable. Protected wolf populations in Italy began slowly expanding their range on their own, dispersing north, crossing the Alps. In 1992, a wolf was confirmed in France for the first time in roughly 70 years, having walked there from Italy entirely under its own power. Similar natural recolonization has since been documented in Switzerland, Germany, and beyond, wolves quietly reoccupying territory their ancestors were driven out of generations earlier without a single human decision beyond simply choosing to stop killing them. That's the detail worth sitting with. The extinction took centuries of deliberate, well-funded, institutionally supported effort. The recovery, once that effort stopped, largely took care of itself. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the ecological damage caused by wolves was ever proportional to the effort spent eliminating them, why would removing that human pressure alone be enough to reverse it? The honest answer is that the fear was never really proportional to the threat in the first place. It was proportional to the story. A few dozen deaths in Gévaudan, terrifying and real as they were, don't fully explain 1,000 years of institutionalized extermination across an entire continent. What explains it is a fear passed down through folklore, formalized through royal decree, and reinforced generation after generation until it stopped looking like a choice and started looking like common sense. You do a version of this yourself, more often than you'd probably like to admit. The things that terrify you most aren't always the things statistically most likely to hurt you. They're the things you were told, early and often, to be afraid of. A story repeated enough times stops feeling like a story. It starts feeling like a fact you've simply always known, one that never needs to be checked against reality, because checking it never occurred to you as necessary. Modern wolf research keeps circling back to this same gap between perception and evidence. Studies coordinated through groups like the Large Carnivore Initiative for Europe have repeatedly found that actual livestock losses to wolves, in regions where wolves have returned, are a fraction of what public fear surrounding their return would suggest, and that targeted non-lethal measures like guard dogs and better fencing dramatically reduce the conflict that does occur. The wolf standing in front of you today is, in almost every measurable way, less dangerous than the wolf that existed in the story you grew up with. So the next time you hear a fairy tale about something lurking in the woods, you might consider what actually happened the last time an entire continent believed one a little too completely. Because the wolves didn't vanish from Europe because the danger demanded it. They vanished because the story did, and it took the story losing its grip, quietly, decades later, for the animal itself to finally start coming home. 200 years ago, you lived within earshot of wolves nearly anywhere in Europe. Then a story convinced an entire continent to make sure you never would again. And now, walking back across mountains, nobody helped them cross. They're proving the story was always bigger than the truth.